Now, Libyans are digging their heels in protests in key cities, and that's despite the violent response from the police as they try to curb the anti-government demonstrations. World leaders are rounding on Libyan authorities, calling for an immediate end to the clashes. Increasing numbers of protesters are demanding for an end to the 41-year rule of Colonel Gaddafi. Hundreds have been killed and over 1,000 injured during a week of unrest, with reports of airstrikes from the country's own military on Monday. Well, rumors have spread that the Libyan leader had fled the trouble, but Gaddafi later made a brief and defiant TV appearance saying he was still in the country. Well, one of his sons blamed exiles and outsiders for pushing Libya to the brink of civil war, and he denied that live ammunition was being used on demonstrators. Some Libyan ambassadors have quit over the use of force on civilians in protest, and they want the UN to intervene. Well, let's hear some of the international reaction. RT's Gadhafi has more on how the trouble is being felt in Washington.
There have been a few statements from U.S. officials calling for leaders of Libya, Bahrain and others in turmoil to show restraint in handling the protests, and that's about it. No more of that epic coverage of democracy in making kind of things. With Egypt, analysts say it was easier and safer for the U.S. to root for democracy and support the people because there's the army there, which is very powerful and is largely financed by the United States and is now in control of Egypt. But in other countries, in Libya, for example, the U.S. doesn't have that same leverage. So they are much more cautious calling for democracy in those countries. I spoke to some experts here. They say Washington's biggest fear is that those uprisings in the region could bring about leaders who will be hostile to the United States. And many analysts say for the U.S. it's not really about supporting democracy in those countries. It's about securing their interests. In Libya, too, experts say the U.S. would so much rather have things as they were. Muammar Gaddafi was never their favorite leader, that's for sure. But some 7 years ago, he agreed to open up Libya's oil riches to the West and to let them invest in oil production. So they kind of left him alone. But now, with protests spreading like wildfires across the region, the U.S. seems to have little control over what's going to happen next there. As the region becomes increasingly unstable, the price of oil spiked on global markets. It is now at its highest level since before the 2008 financial crisis. Libya, where protests are much more violent than they were in Egypt or anywhere else now, has the richest proven oil reserves in Africa. It is the 12th largest oil exporter in the world, and it threatens to disrupt supplies amid all these protests. So the U.S. might be losing control there. Experts say if the unrest continues and the crude oil prices continue growing as they are now, the U.S. is going to be hit really badly, especially now that it's struggling to climb out of recession. There are reports that a number of Western oil corporations might temporarily gain from this spike in oil prices, but the political unrest in the region makes it all too unpredictable.
That was RT's Gadhafi reporting from Washington. In the meantime, John Laughlin from the Institute for Democracy and Cooperation in Paris says that by supporting the uprisings in the Arab world, the U.S. only gives the appearance of change.
The American double standards in the Middle East are so breathtaking that one doesn't really know what to say. In the case of Egypt, and as in the case of the other countries, the interest of the United States is to present the appearance of change while maintaining political control. That is what the Americans are about. Revolution serves to legitimize a continuation of the status quo, effectively. You may remember in the great novel and film The Leopard, there's the famous saying, "Everything must change so that everything stays the same." And that's really the motto of the Americans in these situations. They're trying to keep a lid on the situation in the Middle East. They're trying to legitimize new versions of the old regime. But of course, that's not to say that there are no social pressures, autonomous social pressures themselves. There are, of course, considerable pressures in these countries.